ordered my hot sauce an hour ago.
Christopher Nolan's Tenet has one of the more amusing reputations of recent cinema. When it came out, audiences seemed to be split into two camps. The people who confidently explained the ending to their friends in the parking lot, and the people who kinda stared off into the middle distance, wondering if they just watched 2.5 hours of backwards explosions without a plot. It became that rare blockbuster that sparked more conversations about comprehension than about characters. So that raises a fun question. Was Tenet actually confusing? Or did audiences just not go in with the right mental tools? Here's the thing. Tenet isn't confusing in the sense of being nonsensical. It's not a puzzle with missing pieces or deliberately opaque art film where ambiguity is the point. It's confusing in a very specific way. It asks you to imagine time working differently than you're used to, and then it doesn't slow down to hold your hand through that process. That's a tall order for a mainstream action movie, because most big blockbusters assume you'll track character motivations and emotional stakes, not the direction of entropy. Think about how time usually works in movies. Even non-linear films like Pulp Fiction or Memento aren't really messing with causality. They reorganize scenes, but what you see is still what caused the next thing that happens. We can follow that easily because our brains like linear cause and effect. If you drop a glass, it shatters. And that makes sense because time helped you see the cause, the drop, before the effect, the shatter. In Tenet, Nolan introduces a world where that basic rule gets bent. Some people and objects move forward through time like normal, and others move backward relative to us. When those two states interact, the neat chain of A leads to B leads to C breaks down. A bullet doesn't get fired, it returns to the gun. A fistfight doesn't unfold like choreography. It looks chaotic because one fighter is perceiving time in reverse. The film expects the viewer to mentally juggle both perspectives at once. Most movies just don't train us for that, and Nolan famously doesn't slow down to explain things twice. Characters drop quick lines about entropy and inversion. The plot jumps into high gear, and suddenly you're watching a military operation play out in two directions at once. It's no wonder some people walked out confused. Not because they're not smart enough, but because the movie demands a different kind of literacy than the average blockbuster. This is where science fiction steps into the conversation, and in particular, a very specific episode of Star Trek The Next Generation called Cause and Effect. If you're a Trek fan, you probably remember it. The Enterprise gets stuck in a temporal causality loop, blowing up repeatedly until the crew figures out how to send information forward in time to prevent the disaster. It's a clever, tightly written episode that forces both characters and the audience to question what they're actually seeing. Cause and Effect makes you realize something important. What you see on screen might not represent the full causal picture. You watch the same events unfold multiple times, but the meaning of those events changes as new information arrives from different loops. Eventually, you understand that even though the events repeat, information can escape the loop and influence future iterations. That's a mind-bending idea if you're not used to thinking about time that way. But after a few loops, your brain gets the hang of it. You start holding two levels of temporal understanding in your head at once: what the characters know and what the timeline itself is doing. That's the exact kind of mental exercise Tenet expects from you. Not because Tenet uses loops, it doesn't, but because it asks you to separate the sequence of events you see from the actual chain of cause and effect. In other words, it wants you to stop assuming that the order you experience things in is the same order in which they actually happened. That's not a normal viewing mode for most people, but it's very normal for fans of certain kinds of science fiction. Another similarity is the idea that information and events don't always move together. In Cause and Effect, the Enterprise can't escape the loop physically, but it can send a clue to its future self.
Watch everything. Give me all the details.
Tenet, the same distinction appears in a different form. Information about future events influences present action, even though the characters experience time differently. If you've already trained yourself to think of time as something other than a conveyor belt, if you're comfortable with the idea that data can behave differently than matter, then you're less likely to hit that mental wall during Tenet. There's also a basic genre expectation that shapes how we watch stories. Traditional action movies treat time as scenery. It's just there so characters can move from scene to scene. Science fiction treats time as a toy box. It encourages you to ask questions. What if time didn't flow normally? What if cause and effect could be reversed? What if we could cheat the system by sending a message backward? If you spend years chewing on those kinds of questions because you've watched Star Trek, or read science fiction, or played narrative-heavy games, you go into a film like Tenet with different assumptions. You're prepared for rules. You're prepared for systems. You're prepared for a movie that treats physics the way a heist movie treats floor plans. And this is probably the real answer to whether Tenet is confusing or whether people just didn't get it. The film expects its audience to bring a certain mindset with them, one that treats time not as a given, but as a variable that can be manipulated. For some viewers, that's an exciting challenge. For others, it's disorienting. Neither reaction is wrong, they're just different viewing expectations. If you've seen cause and effect, you've already internalized a couple of useful habits. You've learned that the timeline you're shown may not be the timeline that matters. You've learned that characters can experience events in ways the audience doesn't fully understand yet. And you've learned to stay patient while the story reveals the structural rules that make the whole thing make sense. That's incredibly helpful when you watch Tenet, because the movie trusts that you're willing to keep thinking even when you don't have all the answers yet. None of this means you have to be a Star Trek fan to enjoy Tenet, or that science fiction fans are inherently smarter. It just means certain forms of storytelling build certain mental muscles. If you spend years watching stories where time loops, splits, repeats, or collapses, then a movie where time runs in two directions at once doesn't automatically feel like a logic puzzle. It feels like a good day at the office. So yes, people who've seen cause and effect might have an easier time with Tenet, not because one explains the other, but because both ask you to rethink your relationship with time and causality. And once you get comfortable doing that, a movie like Tenet stops being confusing and starts being genuinely fun. It becomes less about, wait, what just happened? And more about, oh wow, that's what they were setting up 20 minutes ago. And that little shift from confusion to curiosity makes all the difference.